Hi, my name is Tom Hooper, and this is a video of my investigation into Pride Toronto heritage grants. I'm releasing this research in advance of the upcoming annual general meeting on January 26 in the hopes that it will prompt members to take action. As a response to my inquiries, Pride Toronto hired KPMG to conduct a review. Although that review is complete, KPMG has informed me that it is unlikely the report will be made public prior to the upcoming AGM. I believe members have a right to this information before casting votes at this meeting. My investigation includes research gathered through access to information requests and through community-based sources. I invite you to explore the documents for yourself by downloading the PDF of my investigation. By way of a high-level summary, Pride raised $1.85 million in federal government funding after making a deal to reverse the ban on police participation in Pride. They also filed grant support letters that were not authentic, specifically from the 519 and the Assembly of First Nations. Pride used Cree artist Kent Monkman's name and concept in proposing duplicate, overlapping grant activities, even after Monkman had withdrawn from the project. Pride demanded Indigenous artists sign over legal ownership to their artwork as an attempt to commission an asset. Pride told an art group called IndigiQueer the $600,000 grant they had been involved in was not successful. On the same day, Pride attempted to re-involve Monkman as the lead artist on the same project. Pride promised to hire 50 Indigenous teachers as part of a touring exhibit. Instead, Pride directed these grant funds to pay debt, staff salaries, and operational costs. The Department of Canadian Heritage approved these changes that allowed Pride to include activities in the grant from before Pride even applied for the funds. I will elaborate on these points. In late 2018, after making a deal to include police in celebration, Pride Toronto received 3 federal grants, including a $600,000 grant from the Community Support, Multiculturalism, and Anti-Racism Initiatives program with the Department of Canadian Heritage, a $250,000 grant from the Commemorate Canada program, also with Heritage, and finally, they received $1 million from Public Safety Canada, for a total of $1.85 million. These 3 grants had several overlapping or duplicate deliverables, including a Two-Spirit art exhibit with a tour of Indigenous communities, a celebration of decriminalization in 1969, and targeting police services in Pride celebration. These activities were never completed. The story begins in March 2018. Pride approached world-famous Cree artist Kent Monkman, offering him a budget of $500,000 to create a public art project for the Pride 2018 festival. Monkman's studio declined due to the insufficient lead time. He and Pride Toronto agreed to work toward creating a public art project for Pride 2019 that would, in part, commemorate the 50-year anniversary of Stonewall. Monkman's studio proposed an idea to create a new series of 7 to 10 original large-scale history paintings depicting 2S LGBTQ+ history before and after Stonewall and across Turtle Island. This was to be displayed in custom-built mobile galleries that would tour Pride festivals as well as Indigenous and remote or marginalized communities across Canada. Monkman's studio asked for a contract to begin developing the project. On September 6, 2018, then Pride Executive Director Olivia Nwema held a meeting with then Federal Finance Minister Bill Morneau and Fierté Canada Pride Representative Doug Kerr to discuss grant funding for Pride. Pride then emailed Monkman's studio on September 13, stating they had secured funding for the project, but without providing details about the source or nature of the funding. Monkman's studio requested a research and development fee to develop a proposal for the project, including planning photo shoots with individuals from the community, consulting with contractors for the design, construction, and transportation of a climate-controlled mobile museum, and researching communities for the tour. A few weeks after the meeting with Morneau, Pride board members met to hear the results. According to the board meeting minutes, the board believed that a joint statement reversing the ban on police participation would facilitate funding from various levels of government. The board then reversed the decision by members to remove police participation in accordance with the 2016 Black Lives Matter Toronto protest. Immediately after reversing the police ban, Pride applied for the 3 federal grants. On October 28, 2018, Pride submitted its application for the $600,000 grant, using Monkman's idea for a traveling exhibit. Pride did not share these details or this grant application with Monkman. The application proposed a new exhibit, including the creation of 7 new paintings by Monkman. These were to be unveiled at the Art Gallery of Ontario. During summer 2019, the exhibit was to tour 122 prides from across the country. Pride indicated it was aiming to visit at least 25 Indigenous communities in the tour and would hire over 50 Indigenous teachers and facilitators, 1 educator and 1 storyteller per community, to be employed by the project over the 3 years. They also promised to engage with schools and to build a website. Typically, an art commission involves a license agreement between the client and the artist. The artist owns the art and grants a license permitting the client to use it under stipulated conditions. In cases where a client wants ownership of the art, a separate purchase agreement would be made. On October 18, 2018, with no contract forthcoming from Pride, Monkman Studio sent Pride draft terms necessary for the production of the paintings. Monkman Studio again requested a contract by November 1, 2018, in order to meet production deadlines. On October 29th, the day after submitting the $600,000 grant application, Pride contacted Monkman Studio objecting to the draft terms, specifying that Monkman would retain ownership of his artwork. The next day, Monkman's inquiries about the source and nature of the funding were unanswered. Monkman canceled further development of the project due to Pride's expectation of ownership of his artworks. Behind the scenes, the Ministry of Finance worked as a bridge between public safety and Heritage. On November 2nd, Finance provided to Heritage $250,000 for the grant to commemorate the so-called decriminalization of homosexuality. On June 17, 2021, I filed an access to information request with the Ministry of Finance. After an initial promise to release the documents on January 17, 2022, these have now been delayed to an unspecified date. The 3 ministries working together might explain why hundreds of access to information documents have been withheld, citing cabinet confidences. On November 7, Pride applied for the $250,000 grant. When we compare this with the $600,000 grant application from October 28, we can find remarkable similarities. Both grants suggest an exhibit that would tour 122 prides across the country. Both projects propose that this tour will travel to 25 Indigenous communities. They both will involve schools and will involve the creation of a website. The other elements of the $250,000 grant application show that it was a bridge bringing all 3 grants together. It included a touring exhibit which resembles the one proposed in the $600,000 grant. It brought this together with a celebration of decriminalization and of the police. The grant application indicates that the $1 million from public safety will be included in this project. It also lists various partners, including the 519 Community Center. According to news reports at the time, the board's decision in October 2018 to allow the police to participate in Pride was met with criticism from the community. Heritage asked Pride to provide letters showing community support for their project. Among the letters that Pride provided was a letter from the 519 Community Center, dated November 12, 2018. When I provided a copy of this letter to the 519, they responded indicating that neither the 519 nor any employees had authored or sent the letter to Pride Toronto. The 519 did provide a letter to Pride in February 2018 for a different previous grant for the June 2018 festival. The unauthorized November letter appears to be substantively similar to the February letter, except for a change in the description of the grant. According to the 519, they were consulted by Pride in fall 2018, but decided not to proceed as a project partner, and they were not asked to provide a letter of support. Pride filed with Heritage letters of support from other groups that are substantively similar to the original February letter by the 519. These other organizations did not respond to verify authenticity, including LGBT Youth Line, Sherborne Health Center, Planned Parenthood Toronto, and Rainbow Railroad. In some cases, their signatories are no longer on staff. Given the focus on two-spirit art and a tour of Indigenous communities, Heritage was also looking for letters of support from Indigenous groups. In January 2019, Pride filed a letter, seemingly from the Assembly of First Nations, promising a partnership for the project and listing communities that had been consulted. There are several problems here, but the main issue is that the letter has been attributed to someone who left the Assembly of First Nations in July 2018, 6 months before this letter was written. That person's name and signature were used without authorization, and so these have been redacted from my investigation. The AFN has provided me a response confirming these facts, and also added, the letter is is not a document to the Assembly of First Nations, nor was it issued under the authority of any decision maker of the Assembly of First Nations. At least one letter, though, was authentic. The letter from FCP provided to Pride is an authentic letter, so there was at least some support for Pride in this project. Around this same time, the cash from the $250,000 grant started to flow. As I will later explain, Pride immediately began using these funds to pay expenses unrelated to the original grant project. Instead of hiring Two-Spirit artists, instead of paying money toward teachers and facilitators within Indigenous communities, Pride used some of these funds to pay for debt, staff salaries, or operating costs, and to pay expenses incurred for activities from the previous year. It isn't clear what happened to the public safety grant at this time. On January 22, 2019, the Pride membership voted against allowing the police to participate. The inclusion of police was central to public safety's role in this project. After this vote, the involvement of the $1 million grant in these projects is not certain. An access to information request for these documents was filed June 16, 2021. After initially promising to release the documents, the request has been refused. The Two-Spirit art project was unaffected by the police vote. However, Pride had to find a new artist to replace Monkman, who had walked away in October 2018 because Pride was requiring legal ownership of the artwork. In February 2019, Pride asked Cree and Métis artist Jason Berg to take over the $600,000 project. Berg began redeveloping the project. He hired staff and created an art group called IndigiQueer. On March 25, 2019, Pride sent an updated grant application to Heritage for the $600,000 grant. Pride continued to reference Monkman's involvement in the project, even though he had withdrawn. IndigiQueer asked for a contract from Pride, but they never received one. So IndigiQueer decided to write a contract themselves and sent it to Pride. On March 30th, Pride Operations Manager Bobby McPherson responded with amendments to the proposed contract. Included in these amendments was the same stipulation on ownership that had caused Monkman to walk away. Pride Toronto will have all legal rights over what is produced from this project. Pride was attempting to use these grants in order to commission an asset by taking ownership from Indigenous artists. In both the cases of Monkman and IndigiQueer, these requests for ownership were made by Pride very late in contract discussions. A few days later, on April 4th, Pride arranged 2 phone calls. The first phone call was to IndigiQueer. The second call was to Monkman. The first call was to tell IndigiQueer that the $600,000 grant from Heritage was not successful, and so the project was off. In the second phone call, Pride reapproached Monkman, asking if he would reconsider his public art project for Pride 2020. Pride confirmed it agreed to all of Monkman's original proposed terms, including Monkman retaining ownership of his artwork. On April 10, 2019, Pride confirmed with Monkman the funding for the production of 7 large-scale paintings and the construction of a climate-controlled mobile museum, and expanded the scope of the project. Pride requested material from Monkman's studio to promote the project in the 2019 Pride Guide. On April 11, Monkman Studio provided an image for the Pride Guide in good faith, although there was not yet a signed contract. By the end of April, Pride had not sent Monkman a contract. Issues regarding creative control continued to be a point of concern. On April 29th, Monkman Studio again canceled involvement with Pride due to a lack of contract, disagreements over creative control of project elements, and a lack of confidence in Pride's management of the project. After informing Pride on April 29th that he was canceling his involvement, Monkman had no further communication with Pride about the project. 9 days later, on May 8th, Pride filed an interim report for the $250,000 grant, claiming it had a fully executed contract with Kent Monkman. Attached to the report was the Pride Guide ad. Kent Monkman's project idea was to celebrate resistance, including reference to the 1969 Stonewall riots. The May 8, 2019 interim grant report for the $250,000 grant attributes Kent Monkman's involvement with a project on commemorating decriminalization. It was never communicated to Monkman that the project would be framed as a celebration of the decriminalization of homosexuality. Monkman would not have entertained working on the project if he knew it was being framed this way. The interim grant report also indicates that Pride brought on a formal partner in the Art Gallery of Ontario who would provide match funding, and so the project had doubled in size. When I later provided a copy of this grant report to the Art Gallery of Ontario, it sent me the following response. All conversations between the AGO and Pride were preliminary, and no details were established. The AGO never signed a contract, and never saw or signed any grant applications. That interim grant report was required for Pride to receive the next funding check for $104,500 on May 24, 2019. For the $600,000 grant, Heritage officials were also citing Monkman's participation even after he had informed Pride that he was canceling his involvement in the project. In the recommendation for funding filed a day after Pride had claimed there was a fully executed contract, Heritage officials cited Monkman's 7 new paintings. They also cited a so-called partnership with the Assembly of First Nations. So to summarize this, Pride indicated it had a fully executed contract with Kent Monkman and raised 2 different grants worth a combined $850,000 after Monkman had cancelled his involvement in the project. The funds were supposed to go to Indigenous artists, teachers, and those living within Indigenous communities, yet this project was never implemented as proposed. The timeline going back and forth between Pride, Heritage, Monkman, and IndigiQueer is a bit convoluted, so I made this summary. Besides, historians love making timelines. To get a full picture of Pride's engagements with Monkman and IndigiQueer, please download the PDF of my investigation. By summer 2019, Pride was reporting to Heritage that all of its $700,000 debt had been paid off. Due to this change, Pride would be able to deliver on the touring art exhibit project. Before the contribution agreement on the $600,000 grant could be signed, Pride had to send additional details to Heritage. Officials noticed that Pride made a change in the salary component to only include Pride staff. Heritage told Pride to ensure the salaries of educators and facilitators from Indigenous communities would be included as part of this line. Heritage also asked for a list of Pride festivals and Indigenous communities where the touring art exhibit would travel. Pride provided a list. After providing a list of Indigenous community partners, the contribution agreement was signed with Heritage, and Pride received its first payment of $200,000 on October 2, 2019. The Department of Canadian Heritage provided me with a statement on January 11, 2022. Heritage was first made aware that Kent Monkman was no longer involved in the $600,000 project in the grant report filed by Pride on October 23, 2019. Remember, Monkman informed Pride he was canceling his involvement in the project months before, on April 29, 2019. On January 15, 2020, Pride sent a new update to Heritage by email that indicated Pride would be incorporating a notion of community-centered practice in 2020, with a focus on safety in the context of making culture. It isn't clear, but this might be a possible reference to both the Heritage and Public Safety grants. Also on January 15th, Executive Director Olivia Noema and Pride Toronto parted ways. 2 weeks later, I raised the issue of grants at the January 29th, 2020 Pride Toronto Annual General Meeting. I asked what happened to the $250,000 grant. Then board member Kristen Malloy attempted to redirect my question away from the auditor. Then board co-chair Michael Erickson stated that it would not be appropriate to celebrate decriminalization, so the funds would have been used for other activities that were approved by the granting body. The auditor never answered the question and instead made a joke. Although Erickson stated at the January 29 meeting that Heritage had approved changes to the use of the grant funds, in the days following the AGM, Heritage officials asked Pride about deliverables. Grant officers on both the $600,000 and $250,000 grants were seeking updates in early February 2020, asking about deliverables. So, if not a celebration of decriminalization, a touring exhibit to Indigenous communities, and the creation of a national council with the chiefs of police, how was this money used? For the $1 million public safety grant, we don't know because this access to information request has been refused. It's a 5-year grant that provided Pride with $200,000 per year. We have the final report for the $250,000 grant. It was submitted on April 27, 2020. And for the $600,000 grant, this project is still in progress. However, we have seen the interim grant reports for this project. Let's begin with the $600,000 grant. Erickson worked with Director of Operations Bobby McPherson to prepare the grant reports. Erickson, who identified as Pride's CEO, confirmed on February 14, 2020, that the grant was on track for deliverables, as per Annex A of the Contribution Agreement. Annex A of the Contribution Agreement references this so-called partnership with the Assembly of First Nations. It included a regional touring exhibition to 25 First Nations communities in Ontario, showcasing artworks made by Two-Spirit artists, and references hiring Indigenous educators who will facilitate workshops during the touring of the exhibition. On June 1st, 2020, Bobby McPherson submitted an interim report for the $600,000 grant. McPherson noted the touring art exhibit was the signature activity of the project, but they had to abandon this idea, citing consultations with Indigenous community members and other factors. McPherson reported that a group called IndigiQueer, led by Jason Berg, developed a project plan and prepared a budget. However, McPherson reported that through the process, it became clear that Pride needed to focus on the expected outcomes of the grant and not commit to the expense and potentially unwieldy pan-Canadian art tour. The problem is that, in actual fact, McPherson arranged a phone call on April 4th, 2019, where IndigiQueer was told that the $600,000 grant application was not successful. In a January 19th, 2021 report on the project activities with respect to the grant, McPherson provided two reasons why progress was not made on the project. First, leadership changes at Pride. And second, COVID-19. Let's take a look at the $250,000 grant. Heritage officials commented in internal communications that they had tried unsuccessfully to reach Pride regarding this project. The timeline of the grant ended December 31st, 2019, and officials were concerned about whether deliverables had been met. According to Heritage officials, Pride was overdue in submitting financial and activity reports. Heritage officials noted that they had made several attempts to reach Pride regarding this matter. Officials were asking about deliverables as per the contribution agreement, which specifically outlined the development of a traveling exhibit. On April 27, 2020, Pride Toronto Director of Sponsorship and Strategy, Amber Moyle, provided Heritage with a draft of the final grant report. This draft appears to have been accepted by Heritage officials as the final report. The final report states there were budget constraints in contracting an established Indigenous artist. And yet, a year earlier, on May 8, 2019, Pride had reported a fully executed contract with Kent Monkman and a formal fund matching agreement with the Art Gallery of Ontario. Given Pride raised two different heritage grants to fund this, it isn't clear how budget constraints affected the project. The timeline of the $250,000 heritage grant is from November 2018, when Pride applied for the funds, to December 2019. The final report states that during the timeline of the grant, Toronto's queer community experienced a series of serial homicides, and this led to adjustments in the project. However, the serial killer was arrested in January 2018, over 10 months before Pride applied for the grant. Given his incarceration, it isn't clear how the serial killer could have affected this grant. Heritage officials still accepted this as a reason. Similarly, the final report lists as an activity the June 15, 2018 event commemorating 35 years of AIDS activism in Toronto. This was over 4 months before Pride applied for the funds. Heritage accepted this as part of the grant. The final report for the $250,000 grant discusses the creation of land acknowledgement signs posted at the festival. In June 2019, Pride issued an apology for these signs because they failed to recognize Indigenous people. Heritage still accepted this as part of the final report. Under the category for the Traveling Two-Spirit art exhibit, Pride reported activities with FCP. The final report indicates that Pride covered the costs of VIP, travel, hotel, and party passes for 24 members of FCP. These VIP party passes were covered in June 2018. Again, before Pride applied for the grant. The report also indicates that Pride staff attended the annual FCP conference. These activities were also accepted by Heritage. Instead of using the $250,000 grant toward Two-Spirit artists, Indigenous communities, and Indigenous teachers, these funds were redirected to pay for costs from before the timeline of the grant. FCP was present at the September 2018 meeting with Morneau and provided a letter in support of these grants. When I provided this section of the grant report to FCP, it responded indicating they are made up of many Pride organizations. Each member is autonomous, and FCP has no known record of FCP participation in these VIP passes. On January 12, 2021, officials at Heritage contacted Bobby McPherson asking about a missing financial report for the $250,000 grant. This audited report would have included all revenues and expenditures for the project. McPherson replied that the audit would cost Pride about $10,000. McPherson asked that Pride be excused from this requirement due to Pride's financial strains. Heritage officials decided to proceed on the basis of Pride's grant reports without the required audited financial report. But officials noted that in future funding projects, the financial reporting expectation would be made clear to Pride. After approving Pride's request to proceed without an audited financial report, Heritage officials made a note to the file on February 9, 2021, documenting their consideration of the final report. Although the serial killer was arrested more than 10 months before the application, officials accepted this as a reason for a change to the project. The note to file included activities from June 2018, again, before the timeline of the grant. It also included the hiring of Pride staff. Officials noted it was unclear if the proposed modifications had been discussed with Heritage prior to taking place, as there is no documentation on file. On 3 occasions in their note to file, Heritage officials cited the creation by Pride of an Indigenous Advisory Committee. In later correspondence, these same officials expressed that they weren't clear if the Advisory Committee has an official name and function. Heritage officials also mentioned that Heritage became aware in the April 29, 2020 final report that Pride was not moving forward with the touring exhibit due to a series of unforeseen complications. In March 2021, Heritage officials pieced together that Pride had used Kent Monkman's name for 2 similar but not identical grant projects. Some of these issues were brought to light in a CBC story in June 2021. According to the reporting in the CBC story, Pride claimed that funding was not available at the time to provide Monkman with the commission fee for the project. The article did not report that Pride had demanded ownership of Monkman's artwork. Monkman never had an issue with the commission fee originally offered by Pride for supporting the creation of the works and licensing the rights for exhibition purposes. The CBC quoted Pride as stating that since their new executive director was hired in November 2020, he has prioritized the introduction of many new policies and practices, including transparency in Pride Toronto's partnerships and grant procurement. After the CBC story in June, I made a request to Pride for transparency with respect to these grants. First, I asked Pride to open the books and provide information on where the grant money was spent once it was received from Heritage and Public Safety. Pride denied this request, citing its auditor's approval of Pride's financials. My second request was for a motion to be put toward the Pride membership at the upcoming annual general meeting. This motion was to waive confidentiality agreements for current or former board members and staff who have knowledge of these grants and wish to speak. Pride denied this request, stating that it will follow the process in the Corporations Act for adding items to the annual meeting agenda, not the process indicated in the Pride Toronto bylaws. As a response to my questions about the grants, the Pride Board engaged the accounting firm KPMG to conduct a grant compliance review starting in November 2021. The scope of the KPMG review is limited to only federal grants, not grants from provincial or local governments. The review focuses on the key requirements in grant reporting. The objectives of the review do not encompass the ownership of Indigenous artwork, the treatment of Indigenous artists, or the authenticity of support letters and supposed partnerships. I agreed to meet with the KPMG auditors, and I turned over the access to information documents I had obtained. However, their investigation may be constrained by the terms of reference. KPMG has informed me that it is very unlikely the report will be made public by the time of the annual general meeting on January 26. Pride Toronto has a history of community members confronting settler colonialism and anti-Black and other forms of racism within the organization. The federal grants were received by Pride following a board decision to repeal the Black Lives Matter Toronto demand to remove the police from the festival. The subsequent events surrounding these grants, including the ways in which Indigenous artists were treated, indicate the issues raised by our community have not been addressed. Too often, settler colonialism is framed as a past event, but we are constantly reminded by Indigenous, Two-Spirit, and feminist activists and scholars that settler colonialism is embedded within our government and community institutions in the present. According to Professor Laura Hall, settler colonialism is the systemic, ongoing refusal of Indigenous land rights, economic and political sovereignty, and kinship systems. This includes the devaluing of Indigenous artistic, cultural, and economic rights. My investigation has led me to conclude that settler colonialism remains central to the organization of Pride Toronto. I am calling all members to vote against approving Pride Toronto's financial statements until the following actions have been met. Compensate the Indigenous artists, groups, and communities who were supposed to benefit from these grants. Compensate the individuals and groups whose names and signatures were used without authorization. Waive all non-disclosure agreements for current or former board members and staff who have knowledge of these events and wish to speak publicly. Hold current and former board members and staff accountable for any role they had in administering or reporting on these grants. Publish the full, unedited KPMG grant compliance review to the public. Conduct a full public accounting of government grants received by Pride at all levels. Dismantle the corporate structure of Pride that enabled these events. Listen to Indigenous, Two-Spirit, feminist scholars who have spoken to these issues time and time again. I want to thank those who provided valuable input on this draft, including Laura Hall, Tim McCaskill, Richard Fung, and Gary Kinsman.